The Georgian era is often remembered as one of the most scandalous periods in British royal history, an age of glittering high society, towering ambitions, and spectacular failures. At the center of it all stood King George III, a monarch who prided himself on duty, faith, and family. He was the first of his German dynasty to be born in Britain and speak English as his first language, a king determined to project an image of stability. But destiny had other plans, because his own son, the heir to the throne, would become his greatest source of chaos. King George III's reign was a masterclass in royal dignity, until his eldest son threatened to burn it all to the ground. This is the story of a Playboy prince who lived for gambling, forbidden love, and defying his so-called mad father. His staggering debts and a secret illegal marriage would bring the British Empire dangerously close to collapse. From the very beginning, George, the Prince of Wales, seemed like a disappointment. While his father was devoted to Queen Charlotte and their 15 children, the prince spent his youth chasing pleasure. The king was frugal and deeply religious. The prince was a legendary playboy known for heavy drinking, endless affairs, and spending money faster than anyone could lend it to him. The king had grown up sheltered from his own father, as wild court, and tried to impose strict discipline on his children. But for the prince, royal life felt like a gilded prison. He was barred from having a military career and had no real responsibilities, so he threw himself into the only life he could control, one of extravagant pleasure. He fell in with a fast crowd, including politicians his father despised, and he quickly gained a public reputation for debauchery. When he turned 21, Parliament granted him a generous income, but it barely made a dent in his spending habits. The battle lines were drawn, a virtuous, frustrated king on one side, and his rebellious, spendthrift heir on the other, echoing the generational feuds that had plagued the House of Hanover for decades. Then came the great scandal of his life. In 1784, at just 22 years old, the prince met Maria Fitzherbert, the woman he would truly love. She was 6 years older, a commoner, twice widowed, and worst of all, a Roman Catholic. For the heir to the British throne, marrying her wasn't just unacceptable, it was illegal. One law banned heirs from marrying Catholics. Another required the king's permission for any royal marriage, and George III would never approve. But the prince was consumed by obsession. He reportedly swore he would end his own life if Maria refused him. Exhausted by his desperation, she finally agreed. On a quiet December evening in 1785, inside her London drawing room, they were secretly married. An Anglican priest whose debts the prince had paid off performed the ceremony. In their hearts, they were husband and wife. But in the eyes of the law, the marriage meant nothing, and if exposed, it could cost the prince his crown. While he clung to his forbidden love, he was also plunging deeper into debt. His extravagant lifestyle became the talk of London. He hosted glittering parties, gambled away fortunes, and poured money into transforming his residence, Carlton House. It was said that 1/3 of his income went to his stables alone. By 1787, his debts had grown so enormous that he shut down his palace and moved in with Maria. Desperate, his political allies begged Parliament for a bailout. But whispers about his secret Catholic marriage were spreading. If the rumors were confirmed, Parliament would abandon him. So the prince allowed his ally Charles James Fox to stand in the House of Commons and deny that any marriage had ever taken place. The lie worked. Parliament granted him a massive sum, over $160,000 to pay his debts and more for renovations. Maria was humiliated publicly, but the prince got his money. It was a pattern that would define his life, choosing status and survival over loyalty. Then came the moment that could have changed everything. In the autumn of 1788, King George III fell seriously ill with a terrifying mental disorder. He rambled endlessly, suffered hallucinations, and became violently unstable. Suddenly, the prince stood on the brink of power. The regency crisis had begun. The prince and his allies declared that he had the automatic right to rule as regent, But Prime Minister William Pitt argued only Parliament could appoint a regent, and they could limit his powers. As the debate grew bitter, the prince seemed eager to have his father declared permanently insane. But just as Parliament prepared to strip most of his authority, the king made a stunning recovery in early 1789. The crisis was over. The prince's hunger for power, even at the cost of his father's dignity, was exposed. The king never forgave him. By 1794, the prince drowned in debt yet again. The new total was so massive it would equal hundreds of millions today. This time, his father and Parliament offered a final bargain. They would pay off every penny, but only if he abandoned Maria Fitzherbert and married a Protestant princess approved by the state. Desperate, he agreed. Princess Caroline of Brunswick was chosen. Their first meeting was a disaster. The prince took one look at her and muttered to an aide, "Harris, I am not well. Pray, get me a glass of brandy." Caroline found him no better, fat, unpleasant, and nothing like the man in his portraits. He was so drunk at their wedding that he had to be held upright during the ceremony, and he reportedly passed out on the floor afterward. They managed to conceive one child, Princess Charlotte, but soon separated permanently. He had traded love for money, and the result was misery. For the next decade, he continued living extravagantly, waiting for the crown. Then, in 1810, fate intervened. King George III's illness returned, this time permanently. Blind, deaf, and lost in delusion, he spent his final years locked away in Windsor Castle. In 1811, the Regency Act finally passed, and the prince became the official ruler of Britain. Though notorious for scandal, the Prince Regent also reshaped British culture. He commissioned the fantastical Royal Pavilion in Brighton, began turning Buckingham House into the palace we know today, and became known as the First Gentleman of England. But beneath the polished image, the scandals continued. While Britain fought Napoleon at Waterloo, the regent was more focused on his extravagant coronation robes than on the war. When King George III died in 1820, the Prince Regent finally became King George IV, and his first act wasn't about governing. It was about destroying Caroline. She returned from abroad to claim her place as queen, and he immediately launched proceedings to strip her title and divorce her, accusing her of adultery. But the public, who despised George IV, rallied behind Caroline. She became a national heroine. Humiliated by public sentiment, the government abandoned the trial. The king got one last revenge at his coronation in 1821. When Caroline arrived at Westminster Abbey demanding entry, he ordered the doors slammed in her face. 3 weeks later, she fell ill and died. The king had won, but his reputation never recovered. George IV spent his final years as a bloated, sickly recluse in Windsor Castle. Addicted to alcohol and laudanum, he became a tragic shadow of the dashing young prince he once was. His reign was remembered as ineffective, an era where Parliament's power grew as the monarchy weakened. When he died in 1830, the Times published a brutal obituary declaring, "There was never an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king." And yet, in his final hours, there was one last quiet truth. Before he died, he gave an instruction, that he be buried wearing a miniature portrait he had kept on a ribbon around his neck. Not a portrait of his wife, not a symbol of his crown, but the portrait of the only woman he had ever truly loved, Maria Fitzherbert.